Well, thank you very much for your very kind invitation and for being here tonight. Indeed, it's going to be about the inflation episode we are going through at the moment, not just in the UK, but in other leading economies. And my main thesis is going to be that it was central banks creating the current inflation episode that we're living. First, a few notes on what we mean by inflation. You wouldn't be surprised, the members of the Mises Society, if I make some clarifications about what inflation is. Quite many people, even specialists in economics and macroeconomics, and indeed policy commentators and media specialists, they refer to inflation as changes in sectoral prices. So it's all about, now it's all about energy prices, for example, bottlenecks in supply chains leading to changes or increases in some prices, some relative prices, in particular energy prices, indeed. But this is not inflation. By inflation, we mean a change in the price level. Prices in the economy, in the market economy, they change by the hour, if you like. As long as the level of prices stays the same, well, that's not inflationary. That's just an adjustment of relative prices. I know that it sounds very, how can I put it, introductory, but we need to make this claim in order to distinguish what a change in sectoral or relative prices is as compared to a change in the price level, in the overall price level. And the second point that I would like to make from the beginning is that we cannot possibly think that we can control inflation at all times in the very short term. The best we can do is to look into, in my opinion, monetary variables and try to extract trends over the medium to a long term. So the approach that I'm going to follow here is what's the effect of changes in the amount of money broadly defined in order to identify trends in inflation over the medium to long term. What do I mean by medium to long term? 1.5 to 2 years. That's the best we can do, in my opinion. So whatever is going on now with inflation has to do with what happened to the amount of money 12 or 18 months ago. Well, this is the question that we need to answer to. On the top of the slide, you have the balance sheet of the Bank of England. That's the Bank of England's consolidated balance sheet. And as you can tell, since the global financial crisis, and indeed with COVID-19, it has increased quite notably. From 2008 until just before the start of the pandemic, it was a continued increase over time. And starting in March 2020, the Bank of England resumed the asset purchases programs, and that had an impact, of course, in the size of the Bank of England's balance sheet. The question that we need to answer, in my opinion, the most important policy question is why the first increase in the balance sheet over a few years, over 10 years, was not inflationary, whereas the last or the latest increase in the balance sheet has indeed been inflationary. As you can tell here in this line, this is CPI inflation in the UK. From 2008 until 2019, there has been, if anything, a disinflationary trajectory in the UK. At the same time, the balance sheet of the Bank of England has indeed increased quite a lot. That changed after 2021. After 2021, we had both an increase in the balance sheet of the Bank of England and indeed inflation. So why? Why is that the case? This is the major policy question we need to answer, and I will try to address that question today in my presentation. In order to address the topic, I do believe that we need to make a distinction between different measures of money. This is key to understanding why in the last few years we have suffered from inflation. And I will just make a very basic distinction between a narrow definition of money versus a broad definition of money. By narrow, I mean anything close to the monetary base, M0, however you want to define it, but something that includes cash in circulation plus banks' reserves at the National Central Bank. A very reduced form of the supply of money in the economy. How reduced? Well, normally it's around 5%, if you like, up to 10% of the total amount of means of payments in a modern economy. Whereas, in my opinion, what is much more relevant for policy purposes, broad money includes cash in circulation plus bank deposits, the vast majority of the liabilities of the commercial banking sector. Why is this relevant, in my opinion, this distinction? Because the vast majority of us, I would say, we do use the latter, broad money, when we make a transaction. Well, it's very rare that now people use, I don't know, £100 or more, even less if it is more than £100 for in cash to settle a transaction. What you would use is a debit card, a credit card, or anything else, or a bank transfer. When you do that, what you do is to transfer the deposit from your account into somebody else's deposit. And that involves no monetary-based money at all, no narrow money. The vast majority of the exchanges that we have in the modern economy are exchanged through the interaction of broad money. And again, broad money is cash in circulation plus bank deposits. This is roughly 90 to 95% of the total means of payments available in the modern economy. As I said from the beginning, the approach that I'm going to take is how changes in the amount of money broadly defined affect inflation over the medium to long term. This is something that we can structure around the equation of exchange, if you like. But it's not just a truism exposed. Of course, it has to be true, but it can be a theory if we hypothesize about some of the elements within the equation, and that's what I will be doing today. For M, I understand the quantity of money broadly defined, not the monetary base, but something closer to M3 in the US, M4 in the UK, something that includes the vast majority of bank deposits. Money velocity, and this is something that I will really pay attention to because this is one of the key elements in the quantitative theory of money, or the inverse of the demand for money. P for the price level, it should be all prices in the economy, but just for the purposes of today's explanation, I'm going to proxy P by the CPI. I know that it's a reduced basket of goods and services. It's not all prices in the economy, but for the purposes of today's discussion is good enough. And T for transactions. Rather than total transactions, I'm going to proxy that by the GDP in real terms. So the way to interpret this equation in this case would be the total amount of money in the economy times the inverse of the demand for money, or the money velocity, must be equal to the nominal value of the GDP in the economy, nominal spending. If you like, we can put it in the form of rates of change. That's why I used small caps here. So the rate of growth of money plus the rate of change in money velocity will be equal to the rate of growth of inflation or deflation plus the rate of growth of the economy. There are several misconceptions, in my opinion, about the quantitative theory of money. It is criticized for many reasons. Here I just mentioned three. The first one is that for the quantitative theory of money to function properly, money velocity has to be fixed. Well, I will show you that it doesn't have to. But that's one of the claims of the critics of the quantitative theory of money, that it has to be fixed. No, it doesn't. The second one is that quite often the definition of money that they use to test for the validity of the quantitative theory of money is a very narrow definition of money. In my opinion, this is a flawed approach to the quantitative theory of money. And secondly, quite many people claim that if changes in the amount of money do not translate into inflation immediately, that basically just refutes the quantitative theory of money altogether. Well, that's not the case. There is a delayed effect of changes in the amount of money onto prices. These effects are not automatic at all. As I said before, you need to adopt a medium to long-term approach to assess changes in the amount of money, how they affect inflation over the medium to long term. So I'll go through the 3 points briefly, and if you like, please ask me questions at the end, if you may, about any of them. This is regarding which monetary aggregate to use in order to assess inflation. This is that solid line is CPI inflation, in the US, in the aftermath of the, before and in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, and the shaded area is the, is the monetary base in the US. It's the balance sheet, the size of the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. As you can tell, there was a huge explosion in the size of the monetary base right during the years of the global financial crisis, 2008, 9, and 10, if you like. And in those years, inflation did not increase, actually decelerated and actually came into the negative territory. There was deflation for a few months in the US. So indeed, by focusing on a very narrow definition of money, you are not going to assess inflation. You're not going to get it right. If you want to assess inflationary pressures in the economy, rather than a narrow definition of money, I would suggest that you have to use a much broader definition of money, like M3 growth. If you use M3 growth, this is the discontinued line here, then you can tell that in those years, in the global financial crisis years, the amount of money, the actual amount of money in the economy did not increase that much, actually decelerated and actually decreased. It fell for a couple of terms. And I claim that that explains the fall in inflation during those years. So again, if you want to assess inflation, it is much better to use a much broader definition of money. Much better than a narrow definition of money for sure. How about money velocity? This comes from an empirical study that I did with a colleague of mine using a 100 years database of money velocity in the US. So we're going back to the aftermath of the First World War up to the pandemic years. As you can tell, indeed, money velocity fluctuates. It is not stable at all. It's not fixed, that's for sure. That's an empirical fact that it's not fixed. And it was much more volatile before the 1950s. Afterwards, it has become much more stable. But the property in the series, the technical property in the series that matters the most for us is that the series is stationary. It's mean reverting, which means, yes, it does fluctuate upwards and downwards, but on average, it reverts to the mean. So eventually, it will revert to the average value, which is roughly minus 0.8% pre-COVID data, or minus 1.1% if we include the COVID episode. Why is this so relevant? If we were assessing inflation or deflationary pressures back in the midst of the pandemic in 2020, and we observed this huge fall in money velocity, well, if we knew at that time that money velocity would eventually return to an average value, we would know that it wouldn't be here forever. Eventually, money velocity would recuperate, would return to something much more reasonable, let's put it that way. Okay? That was very extraordinary. As you can tell, well, in no other time in history, money velocity had declined that much. And why did it happen? Well, we know that it was a huge, it was a time of with a huge uncertainty about the future of not just the economy, the future of life, if you may. So people did run for liquidity. That means there was a huge fall in the demand, a huge fall in money velocity because there was a huge increase in the demand for money. And that's what this value is reflecting. But again, the key point here is, yes, it does fluctuate, but it returns to its mean eventually. And no, it's not right to say that changes in the amount of money have an automatic effect on inflation. That has never been the case. Yeah? It takes time. And these are the delays, the time lags observed in the US economy. It's country specific, I appreciate that, but this is something that we can take as a benchmark for a leading economy. So say that there is an excess in money balances. Monetary policy has become too loose, and there is too much money, as if it were, in the economy. That will have an effect first in asset prices. So any asset manager holding a portfolio of assets will have too much cash in their portfolios. And that too much cash in their portfolios is not good news. They're not getting any revenues out of it. So what they will try to do is to diversify, to get rid of that excess in cash by investing in other alternative non-monetary assets. When they do that, they will be increasing the demand of other assets. That's why it's not a coincidence that whenever there's an excess in money balancings in the market, in financial markets in particular, there is an increase in the appetite for other alternative assets which pushes up asset prices. That's why at the worst of the pandemic, in the spring, summer 2020, the economy was plummeting, and yet the stock market recovered very, very quickly. That's something we observed in a question of weeks or even months. Once the value of the company's assets is much higher than before, because we have asset price inflation, then companies will be much more willing to invest, to expand their businesses, to hire more people. It will take more time, possibly 2 to 3 quarters more, but eventually both companies and individuals, households, will be in a better position because of asset price inflation to spend more, to hire more people, to borrow more money. That will increase nominal spending. Whenever that happens, especially in the context of the pandemic, but it doesn't have to be such a radical scenario, we have an increase in demand that cannot be accommodated by supply. And indeed, that will be inflationary. So the problem that I have, it's not that I have it, that I think it's not right actually, with explanations of inflation that focuses only on the last stage that I just explained, is that they claim that inflation is just a demand side factor. Well, yes, but you need to look at what happened before that, ultimately with what happened to the amount of money in the economy broadly defined. So yes, it may take a few quarters, 1.5 to 2 years, but the excessive money balances eventually will be translated into changes, well, an increase in CPI prices. And this is just, again, coming from the study that I mentioned before with a colleague of mine, the two sides of the equation, or the quantity equation that I mentioned before. Broad money is the orange line, and nominal GDP is the right-hand side of the equation, that's the blue line. As you can tell, it's not that they are coincidental, but there is indeed a correlation between the two. You can tell how big of a divergence we experienced during the COVID-19 years. That was quite exceptional. And no wonder that divergence had to be corrected with an increase in prices afterwards. So this is not just, as I said, something theoretical. This is something that we can use for policy purposes. And indeed, the last central bank that I can remember that used this framework to make monetary policy decisions was the European Central Bank up to 2003. It was actually the official monetary policy strategy implemented by the European Central Bank. So let's just use the example of the UK economy, and let's try to use the quantitative theory of money in order to prescribe a monetary policy compatible with price stability over the medium to long term. Well, all we need to do is to solve the quantity equation for M, small m for the rate of growth of broad money. So all we need to do again is to solve this equation and then factor in whichever the values you think are best or represent better your economy. In the case of the UK, P is going to be the inflation target given to the Bank of England every year, 2%. T for the rate of growth of real transactions in the economy, or the real GDP. I'm being very optimistic here, but something around 2%. That's used to be before the pandemic, or even before the global financial crisis, the trend, a real rate of growth of the UK economy. But you may claim that is too generous. And how about V? Well, V, the decline in money velocity is around -1%, as I said before, for the US and for many other leading economies. So those are the figures that I'm factoring into this equation. And that, once you do that, you will get to this range of growth of money, broad money, compatible with that economy, with a 2% price stability economy. Money should grow, no less than 4% and no more than 5%. roughly speaking. If you tend to produce too much money in the economy, over 5% persistently, that will lead to inflationary pressures. And just the opposite in case money grows at a rate lower than 4% persistently. Just to give you the context of where we were back in 2021, at the peak of the pandemic between 2020 and 2021, M4 in the UK grew at 15% on an annual basis. That's, well, as you can tell, 3 to 4 times higher than that rate compatible with price stability. So if you were analyzing these figures back in 2020 and 2021 using the quantitative theory approach to inflation, you wouldn't have been that surprised that a couple of years down the line, inflation is where it is at the minute. Well, this is something actually that we did actually. We wrote about it. A colleague of mine, Tim Condon, and myself, we published it in, well, it was the IA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, publishing it for us. We took the data from the spring 2020 and got it published in June 2020. And we alerted of inflation at that time. Inflation about around 5 to 10% for the US economy in 2021 to 2022. And all we did is to use the approach that I just told you about. So who is to blame for this, for the current inflation episode? Well, this is the state of the equation, or this was, still is, unfortunately, the state of the question in the US, in the UK, and in the Eurozone. I'm just going to use some quotations from the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Mr. Powell. The growth of M2 is the broad definition of money they use over there, doesn't really have important implications for the economic outlook. And this is not something he said years ago. This is February 2021. Another one, the link between money and inflation ended about 40 years ago, December 2021. If this is the approach, this is your mindset to understand inflation, well, again, there's no surprise that they didn't know what was going to happen with inflation a few months later, basically. They've been massively surprised by the events afterwards. Something similar can be said about the European Central Bank. The ECB changed what they call the monetary policy strategy, and basically what they did is to give less value to the information provided by money in assessing inflation. That's something that the ECB used to do quite a lot. It used to give quite a lot of weight to the information provided by broad money in assessing inflation, but it doesn't do it anymore. And as regards the Bank of England, I'm not bringing any quotes from the Bank of England, but I can tell you that in the quarterly report, the official quarterly report published by the Bank of England, the monetary policy report, you may find one mention to money in the whole report, maybe, if you're lucky. But most likely you wouldn't find any mention to money. So what I'm trying to say is that in the mindset of those making monetary policy decisions in major economies, the US, the Eurozone, and the UK, this is not really, the effects of changing the amount of money on prices is not really what they have as a priority. So what major policymakers, indeed central banks, thought at the time, 2020 and 2021, is first that COVID-19 was going to be accompanied by disinflationary effects over the medium term. This is not something short term, no. It's going to be something that is going to continue over time. Then in 2021, they had to change their assessment of the economy, and they thought that inflation was going to be higher than they expected, but transitory, whatever that meant. And then finally, a few months later, they had to acknowledge that they had a major policy mistake, and they had to start fighting inflation. But as you can tell, they were not really ready to address inflation in 2020 or 2021. This is something that Charles Wohlhart has referred to as central banks, current central banks, they don't really have a coherent theory of inflation, but rather a bits and pieces approach to inflation. This is something really, really worrying, because the authorities in charge of making policy decisions, monetary policy decisions, don't really have a consistent, reliable explanation of inflation. So this has revealed in the latest crisis as a major flaw in their strategies, and it's something that we haven't sorted out yet. So we may be we may repeat the same errors in the future. And this is something referring to the Bank of England's official forecasts. This is something that I took from the Monetary Policy Report in November 2020, and 1 year later in November 2021. If you just focus on the Bank of England's views of inflation back in November 2020, as I said before, yes, inflation is decelerating. It will recover in 2020, 2021, and it will stay around 2%. Yeah. So yes, it's disinflationary, and it will stay around 2% after 2021. And even 1 year later, again, as late as November 2021, they had to acknowledge that indeed inflation is on the rise, and it may increase up to 4.5, even 5% in early 2022, but quickly it's going to return to the 2% inflation target. And as you can tell in the axis, they did not even consider inflation to be higher than 8%. Are you familiar with this? If you're familiar with these so-called fan charts, the darker the color, the red color in this case, the more probable that forecast will be, according to the Bank of England. So it was not even in the cards that inflation was going to be higher than 8%, that it has been, as you know. That's the extent of the policy error made by the Bank of England in the last 2 years. And to give you more evidence about why I think they got it that wrong, here you have these two lines for the CPI in the UK. The blue line is core inflation, so overall inflation, excluding for the most volatile components in inflation, energy and unprocessed food items. And the other one, of course, the red line is overall CPI inflation with all the components. So indeed, from the summer, at least from the summer 2021, it was quite evident that inflation was on the rise. Still from very low base, but still it was very clear that the trajectory was upwards. And well before the start of the war in Ukraine in February 2022, inflation was quite a problem already. So I'm sorry, the war in Ukraine is not the cause of the current inflation episode, not in the UK, not in the Eurozone, not in the US. Inflation preceded the war in Ukraine in all these economies. And even if we discount for the effects of the war, if you like, on energy prices, if you just focus on the blue line, core inflation, it's still at something close to 6.2%, if I remember well, above 6%, which is 3 times higher than the inflation target given to the Bank of England. So I'm sorry, there is something else that has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine that is explaining inflation in the UK. And this is just for comparison. The 3 lines up there correspond to the UK, that's the UK inflation, that's the red line. The purple one is for the Eurozone, and the darker blue is for the US. So the rate of inflation in these 3 major economies has been pretty high, much higher than that in other well-developed economies, such as Switzerland, the lighter blue line, and the green line is for Japan. And those economies, we claim, at least I do claim, they do suffer from the same bottleneck effects in international markets, if you like, energy prices going up, and yet they haven't experienced inflation as we have. Why is that? Well, if we go back to what happened to the amount of money a few years before in 2020 or 2021, guess what happened in the US? This is the rate of growth of money in the US. up to 25% on an annual basis. In 2021, 25%. That's the highest rate of growth of money since the end of the Second World War in the US. How about in the UK? Well, 15%. In the Eurozone, something close to 12%. How about the other two economies? Well, the amount of money increased, but not as much as in those three economies that I just mentioned. So, who to blame for the current inflation episode? Well, I blame the monetary policy maker. Now here is depicted as William Pitt the Younger in this very famous caricature by James Gilroy. Well, here is representing the power of the state when the state took over the power of the Bank of England to produce more money during the war times with France. At that time, obviously, the amount of money was restricted by the gold standard. So the amount of paper notes the bank could issue had to be linked to the value of the reserves, the gold reserves held by the Bank of England. Of course, that system is not operating anymore. So the power of the state, of the money policy maker to increase the amount of money is unlimited. Theoretically, potentially, they can increase the amount of money as much as they wish. And actually, they proved that point in the last 2 years. So, yes, indeed, I think we should blame the monetary policy makers for the increase in inflation in the last couple of years, not just in the UK, but also in the Eurozone and indeed in the US. This is some more data regarding the rate of growth of money in the UK. The red line is the annual rate of growth, and the green line is the annualized rate in the last 3 months. So as you can tell, before the pandemic, with the exception of an intervention by the Bank of England at the time of the referendum, the EU referendum, it was quite stable, around something close to 4.5%, indeed compatible with 2% rate of inflation, and that changed dramatically in 2020 and 2021 with a rate of growth of money close to around 15%. And now, quite quickly, it's returning to something much more moderate. Actually, there has been a very sharp deceleration in the amount of money in recent months, returning to something closer to 4%. So if you want to hear more, well, I would be more than happy to take your questions or comments about this, but if you want to hear more about this approach to the understanding of inflation, this is something that we do at the Vinson Centre at the University of Buckingham. We have a very ambitious program of events considering the effects of money on prices. And this is something that also the Institute of International Monetary Research has been doing for years, also based at the University of Buckingham. Thank you very much.